Nehanda Charwe Nyakasikana's last words, "My bones shall rise again," have become an enduring slogan in Zimbabwean history, representing the spirit of resistance and hope for future generations. Nehanda Charwe Nyakasikana, commonly known as Mbuya Nehanda, was born in the early 19th century, around 1840 in what is now modern-day Zimbabwe. She belonged to the Zezuru subgroup of the Shona people, a significant ethnic group in the region. She used her influence as a spiritual leader to galvanize various communities across Zimbabwe and unite them in their resistance against British colonial forces. The Nehanda spirit that Charwe Nyakasikana had possessed women for at least 500 years. A prominent figure within Zimbabwe's Shona culture in the early 1400s was Princess Nyamita, the first Nehanda spirit. She was the daughter of the first Monomatapa Mutota and a respected and influential ancestorial Mondoro spirit that possessed other spirit mediums after her death. It was believed she could interpret the orders and wishes of Mwari, the supreme creator deity. The spirit mediums she possessed claimed this same power and communicated her beliefs through her tone. One of the most memorable and inspirational mediums that claimed Nyamita Nehanda's spirit was Nehanda Charwe Nyakasikana. Being the late Nehanda's medium, she was the center of communication between the living Shona societies and the ancestral spirits. This spiritual role gave her significant influence among her people, and she became a respected spiritual leader, also referred to as Mbuya Nehanda and Mbuya Charwe. She is commonly referred to as the grandmother of present-day Zimbabwe and is among the early African resistance to European colonialism in the region. In the late 19th century, the British South Africa Company, formed by Cecil John Rhodes, began an aggressively colonizing Zimbabwe, particularly in Mazowe. Relations between the British settlers and the Africans deteriorated as the invaders increased in numbers in the 1880s. Historical accounts state that in 1888, Rhodes and his colleagues deceived King Lobengula of the Ndebele people to secure mining rights. Using this concession, they obtained a royal charter in 1889, allowing them to colonize Zimbabwe and subjugate its people. Rhodes recruited 200 white settler soldiers in June 1890, funded through the exploitation of African mine workers. Most of these settlers arrived in Salisbury, present-day Harare, on 12th of September 1890 and officially annexed Zimbabwe as a British colony the next day. This influx of settlers led to anger from the Mashauna rulers as a result of land and cattle confiscation, as well as the mistreatment of women. The British settlers displayed white supremacy by viewing the African people as primitive, barbaric, and superstitious. The situation worsened between 1890 and 1896, with both spiritual and traditional leaders opposing oppressive European rule in Zimbabwe. One notable religious leader who played a role in this resistance was Nehanda. She was a prominent religious leader in Mashonaland during the arrival of British settlers and held a remarkable position in the male-dominated Mashona priesthood. Her leadership role within Zimbabwe's religious community granted her substantial power and influence. Nehanda vehemently opposed the oppressive British colonial rule from the outset, considering white people to be violent, inhumane, and destructive. She believed that the spiritual figure Mwari disapproved of the British presence and demanded their removal. By 1894, the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil John Rhodes, imposed what they termed the hut tax against the African populations consisting of both the Ndebele and Shona people. In addition to the hut tax, the British imperialists began to impose forced relocation and forced labor camps. Nehanda witnessed her people endure forced displacement from their ancestral homes, racial and political oppression, economic exploitation, dehumanizing forced labor, and brutal physical torture by the settlers as more British settlers arrived in the country. Before the first Chimurenga uprising, or Liberation War of 1896, Nehanda dedicated herself to training men and women who volunteered to fight under her leadership. Her reputation extended beyond her own Shona community and gained recognition among other groups. King Lobengula, the ruler of the Ndebele kingdom, recognized Nehanda's spiritual prowess and acknowledged her influential role in the land and allowed her to recruit Ndebele people to join the Liberation War. The unique element of the Chimurenga War was the leading roles played by three traditional spiritual leaders, or Mondoro: Mukwati in Matabeleland, Kagubi in western Mashonaland, and Nehanda, the only woman in central and northern Mashonaland. She conveyed prophecies and guidance that inspired and motivated the communities to stand together and fight against the colonial oppression. Her messages often carried a sense of urgency and a call to defend their land, culture, and sovereignty. In 1896, Nehanda received orders from Mukwati, the Mashona chief priest, who resided at Tabazika Mambo in the Matopo Hills, and her prepared soldiers were ready to confront colonialism and economic exploitation. She established her military headquarters in the caves of Husaka Mountain, well guarded at each entrance. Nehanda's primary targets during the anti-colonial war were white settlers, including their farms, mines, trading posts, policemen, and Africans who collaborated with the colonists. The war raged in Mashonaland from June to August 1897. Due to the gravity of the conflict, Britain dispatched 500 imperial troops under Colonel Edwin Alderson, but they proved ineffective and were eventually withdrawn, giving the upper hand to the Zimbabwean troops. Nehanda was a dedicated and disciplined commander who accompanied her highly motivated soldiers to the battlefield. Nehanda performed several significant acts in her resistance, such as providing the whereabouts of white settlers and keeping the morale of the fighting forces through spiritual fortitude. At first, the Shona and Ndebele experienced victories on the battlefield. However, the war began to turn in favor of the British forces by mid-August. This was accomplished through negotiations of certain regions, increased firepower, and the lack of supplies for the Mashona troops. In December, Nehanda was captured in the Dande district and taken to Salisbury, now Harare, under heavy guard. This capture of Nehanda brought the anti-colonial war to an end in Mashonaland. Colonial records and accounts often portrayed Nehanda as a dangerous and rebellious figure, and her capture was intended to quell the resistance movement and send a message of British supremacy. Kaguvi, the other spiritual leader, who was tried at the same time as Nehanda was sentenced to death for killing a police officer. He converted to Christianity and was christened Dismas, which was the name of the thief saved by Jesus on the cross. Kaguvi was hanged nonetheless, but his conversion was apparently meant to send him to heaven. She was charged for the murder of Native Commissioner Henry Hawken Pollard, a British commissioner who had become notorious for his cruelty, and her charges included the rebellion against colonial authority. As she was held hostage, the Reverend Father Francis Richards of the Chishawasha Mission tried to convince her to convert and repent. However, she refused to be converted to a foreign and alien religion, exemplifying her deep commitment to her religion and people. On 2nd March 1898, she was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Her execution was authorized by the British High Commissioner for South Africa, Alfred Milner, and supported by the Imperial Secretary. The judge presiding over the execution was termed the Hanging Judge, John Watermeyer. Herbert Hayton Castens served as Public Prosecutor Sovereign with the British South Africa Company territories, who prosecutes for and on behalf of Her Majesty. On the day of her execution, she showed no fear. Nehanda Charwe stated, "My bones shall rise again," ultimately predicting her legacy and revolutionary spirit in the liberation movements to come. Nehanda was a dedicated nationalist who held strong morals and principles. Her defiance of the oppressive white rule and exploitation exemplify her strength and perseverance for her people. She sacrificed her life in the fight so that her people could one day live in peace and control their political destiny. Nehanda's words, "My bones shall rise again," are believed to have predicted the Second Chimurenga from 1960 to 1980, which culminated in the independence of present-day Zimbabwe. Nehanda played a crucial role as a resistance leader in Zimbabwe's struggle for national identity. Her influence paved the way for women's participation in subsequent liberation movements, as demonstrated by their involvement in nationalist protests and the Second Chimurenga. In 1960, women from the National Democratic Party led a protest in Salisbury, present-day Harare, resulting in the arrest of over 2,000 women. They organized this protest in response to the approval of a new constitution that symbolized colonial dominance. Zimbabweans were granted only 15 out of 75 parliamentary seats, which was seen as an unjust imbalance. Many men were unaware of their wives' involvement in the protests until their arrests, and the women held signs with messages like, "Women do not accept this backward constitution." Despite facing maltreatment, arrests, and imprisonment, these women remained steadfast in their dedication to the cause. The courage displayed by these women was inspired by the legacy and actions of Mbuya Nehanda, who had fought for similar ideals 80 years earlier. When the nationalist liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s rose in Africa, Zimbabwe's local guerrilla factions were raising the spirit of Nehanda in their independence struggle. This included the likes of then-young guerrilla factions under Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union and Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union. The women's involvement in the anti-colonial struggle extended beyond passive forms of resistance and protests. They also participated in guerrilla warfare during the Second Chimurenga, further cementing their role as vital contributors to Zimbabwe's fight for independence and national identity. Women's participation in the guerrilla war was not merely to increase the number of soldiers, but also an assertion of their right to emancipation. During the Second Liberation Movement, the number of female recruits surged from just 100 in 1972 and 1973 to approximately 10,000 by the mid-1970s. These women were not only combatants, but also played crucial roles in supplying war resources like ammunition, medicine, and food, as they were less likely to raise suspicion on the front lines. In a base along the Pongwe River in Mozambique, about 40 kilometers from the Zimbabwean border, female comrades underwent rigorous daily training. In 1975, a troop that originated from the eastern region of Zimbabwe was attacked by Rhodesian scouts, but successfully defended themselves and their cargo. The strength and determination displayed by these women, much like Nehanda's, challenged the prevailing notion of women's roles in society and their capabilities. From 1975, the failure to ease hostility and the escalation of the war necessitated the increased recruitment of women, some of whom occupied posts as commanders and political commissars. In 1978, Terai Ropa, leader of the Zimbabwe African National Union's Department of Women's Affairs, stated, "Gone are the days when all women did was sew, knit, cook, commiserate with, and mourn their fallen soldiers. Now they too participate in the fighting." Nehanda's legacy from the first Chimurenga influenced these women to join the fight against colonial rule, ultimately achieving her goal of liberation. However, it is important to mention that it was not easy for women to be a part of the war effort, as they struggled for equality. In camps, women experienced much abuse and were often used just to transport supplies. The war songs that resonated throughout the Second Chimurenga conveyed the aspirations of the liberation movements and incorporated a blend of both historical and contemporary narratives of resistance. Among these songs, Mbuya Nehanda, Kufa Vachitaura, Grandmother Nehanda Died Speaking, stands out as one of the most renowned. It is widely acknowledged that the contribution of the legendary Mbuya Nehanda was pivotal to the ultimate success of the liberation struggle. Following Mbuya Nehanda's execution, British forces took her head and those of other rebels as war trophies. For over 30 years, Zimbabwe has been trying to recover these remains, believing her skull remains on display in a British museum. However, the Natural History Museum, as well as the Cambridge University's Duckworth Laboratory, insists there is no evidence to confirm whether Nehanda's skull is held within their huge collection of more than 43,000 human remains combined. Both institutions have indicated their willingness in assisting the government of Zimbabwe in its efforts. In 2015, UNESCO included the trial dockets of Nehanda and Kaguvi in its Memory of the World Register, recognizing their outstanding universal value. In 2021, a new statue of Nehanda was unveiled in Harare, designed by Zimbabwean sculptor David Guy Mutasa. Additionally, in 2022, the government of Zimbabwe announced the renaming of Victoria Street in Harare to Mbuya Nehanda Street, further honoring her historical significance and enduring legacy. Mbuya Nehanda's defiance of oppressive white rule and exploitation showcased her resilience and determination to secure a better future for her people. She made the ultimate sacrifice in the struggle so that her people could one day live in peace and have control over their political destiny. Mbuya Nehanda's legacy as a fearless leader in the fight against colonialism remains deeply ingrained in Zimbabwean history and national identity. She is celebrated as a national hero and an icon of courage and strength. King Lobengula of the Ndebele people, who is mentioned in this video, was the son of Mzilikazi Kamashobane, the first king of the Ndebele nation in Zimbabwe. Please check out my video on King Mzilikazi. If you'd like a longer, in-depth version of his story, please let me know below in the comments. And if you're passionate about delving into the rich heritage of the African continent, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you not only show your appreciation for the captivating stories we share, but also become an integral part of our growing community of history enthusiasts.